everyone, Christina Herrick, produce editor for The Packer and host of Tip the Iceberg. And I'm here with another episode. And I'm really excited because Michael Santiago, president of FloraPulse, is joining me. And I've written about FloraPulse before, so I'm really excited to have a conversation about where the technology is going and kind of the future of FloraPulse. So thank you for joining me, Michael.
Awesome to meet you, Christina. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk a little bit about florables and where the future of ag is going, particularly when it comes to irrigation.
Yeah. So, I thought a great way to start this conversation is to really set the table. So, kind of setting up some of the challenges that irrigation has. Obviously, I'm well versed in FloraPulse, so maybe you could talk about what states you're operating in and maybe where you started, and then kind of set the table for, what that means for irrigation, and then just kind of go into the future of irrigation and challenges.
Sure. Well, so, taking a broad picture, right, irrigation, water is the biggest input in agriculture, and it's extremely important. People keep saying that their wars might be fought in the future over water. And so there's a huge number of challenges that, keep coming to the fore. There's more people, so there's more need to grow produce, and it requires water. And it requires water that is supplied effectively at the right time, depending on the crop, on the soil, the rain, etc. There's also, often there's water scarcity. So, for example, in California, every so often we have a drought, but it only comes in for maybe a few years, and then people kind of forget. There's We're having issues also with like groundwater management. So anyway, so there's all these problems that require just being mindful with water, and this is kind of where FloraPulse comes in. So FloraPulse, we've developed these sensors that measure the water status of a tree. So just like when you're thirsty, right? You're like, oh, I feel thirsty. Let me drink some water. We can provide that same feedback for the trees, right? So that way, oh, the trees need water. Let me water them. And so this really drives a lot of improvements in a lot of different things like yield and quality because you're just keeping the trees happy. Before FloraPulse, really growers had no good tools, let's just say, to measure water status in the tree. So in terms of the company, we're a relatively small company, 5 people. We were started in 2017, so we've been around for I don't know, 7 years now. It's crazy how time flies. I have been involved though in this for about 12 years now. So it all started as part of my PhD at Cornell University, where we developed these first sensors, and then people got really excited because again, it gives you this like direct measurement of water status for trees, which growers have been looking for a long time. And so, so we've been doing a lot of research in the last, 7 years. And then we launched product in 2020, which was an interesting year to launch a product. But everything, has worked out well. We've been mostly funded with government contracts and sales. So we have a different playbook from the typical venture-backed company. So we were really focused on the development technology and just kind of pushing it out there. And yes, we've been, making sales since then. A lot of them to scientists, but maybe about half of them to growers. We're now in about 25 countries or so. We're a lot of different crops and just kind of getting the word out there. We're excited. We're launching this actually in the next couple of weeks. We're launching a new product, which is a smaller version of the sensor for these smaller crops, such as like the really small wine grapes and blueberries and so forth. And so in terms of like how we fit, things are why is it becoming more important? So the technology like ours is critical for just kind of moving humanity forward.
Yeah, and I remember a little bit about this, but I'm going to let you kind of talk about it. So you talked about water status and kind of what talk about what that means, like when you're looking for water status in a plant, and then maybe you could use the example. Obviously, I know FloraPulse was founded really with wine grapes and studying wine grapes in particular. So talk about water status and what that means to both the plant and then the crop that it's growing. Because obviously, I think that's one of the big things with FloraPulse in wine grapes is you sometimes you want water, you want some you want to deprive the plant a little bit of water if that yields a different type of grape. So kind of talk about like what water status means and then kind of what FloraPulse does and what it
Yep,
tells
yep, yep.
the user.
Oh, yeah, you have a good memory, Christina. So we measure water status, and in a simple terms, it's really the pressure of the water inside the plant, right? So just like humans have blood pressure, and you're supposed to keep that between 80 and 120, something along those lines. For trees, it's the same thing, right? You want to keep the water status between these levels. If it gets too high, if it's too wet, then you have more problems with fungi and diseases, and you're kind of drowning the plant. Really, if the water status goes too high, it even lacks oxygen. So that's one. That's the most common way people kill houseplants is by overwatering them. And then if the water status is too low, then your trees just can't transpire, so they grow slowly. The leaves kind of droop. They're more diseased. They're prone to disease. And so yeah, with FloraPulse, we literally measure the water pressure, the water status inside the tree. This has been extremely difficult to do because just for the scientists and the geeks out there, water pressure inside the plants is negative. So you have a liquid that's under negative pressure, which makes it difficult to measure. Now, what does this mean in terms of, like, for example, wine grapes are just fascinating because the best wines, right? The point is not just to have like the biggest grapes, is to have like these like really complex, like very fancy wines that people prize. And to do that, you really have to stress the vines, right? You have to, if you have good grapes, like very high quality grapes, you're gonna have high quality wine. And to get the high quality grapes, you want to stress the vines. You need to give them and you want to give them more water towards the beginning of the season and then less water as it goes on. And that thirst, that need for water, is what it stresses the plant. That's what leads the plant to create these, the phenols and all these different. It also makes the juice a little bit more concentrated. And so the advantage of FloraPulse is that yeah, you can measure that, and so you can really tweak. And so we like to say that you can with FloraPulse you can like set the same vintage, right? You can tweak your vintage, have a good vintage. Because if you look at places like Bordeaux, for instance, where they do not allow growers to irrigate, right? Then the drier years they tend to have better quality, and so it's amazing because you can see like the price per bottle goes from like 200 to like $600, or just from one year to the next because of this. So again, with florals, you can just put water at the beginning of the season to get the vines growing initially, and then when you need to, once the grapes are a little bit bigger, then you can cut it off, and so you can really tweak the thirst of the plant, which you were not able to do before.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking, I'm also thinking, and a completely different, but cherries too. And I realized too, the other interesting thing about FloraPulse is you're actually getting the breeding in the plant. You're not getting even if you're doing drip irrigation, you're doing something. There's still, I'm sure there's a little bit of water that doesn't get to the plant as much as you're trying to get as much as you can. So you're really with FloraPulse, the interesting thing I think is you're literally getting how much water the plant has, what's in there, what it's utilizing, right? Which I think is the interesting thing.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like you if you are wondering, do I need to irrigate this tree or the vine, then you want to ask the vine, right? And the problem is because if you're measuring the soil or the weather or how much water comes out,
Yeah.
all these things are useful, but they don't really tell you the whole story, right? Because you might be measuring the soil in this particular spot, but this other spot is a little bit wetter, a little bit drier. Or you might be saying, oh, we irrigated this much, so we're good. But then you might not know that there's like an underground water reservoir that the plants are drawing water from. And also, if you always irrigate the same amount, then some weeks it's going to be really hot, so you really should be irrigating more, and some weeks are going to be a little bit cooler. And so this is the problem. Like you really want to be able to ask the tree. Also, just it's complicated. So for crops that have like shallow root systems, like if you're growing tomatoes in a greenhouse, then you kind of know, you can weigh the pot, and you have full control over the system, so you kind of know where the water goes. But when you have a tree or a vine that's been, growing there for, 10, 15 years, the roots might be 20 feet deep. And so you have like no idea about that. And the soil might be different. And so you really need to ask the tree to get good quality data.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of data, let's talk about that. So the other thing that I think we should probably talk about is just what FloraPulse is. Like I know what it is. Again, I've written
Mhm.
about it, so I understand it's a device and kind of where it goes. Talk about that and kind of set up what a grower would have to do to add FloraPulse
Sure.
to their crop, and then talk about some of that information, that feedback that they're getting from FloraPulse.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, just get a little technical here. This whole technology is a little microchip that mimics how plants transport water, right? So that's how we're able to actually measure the pressure of the water inside the plant, we built, in some ways like a little tree that you put inside this tree. And then those trees communicate, and then you get to hear and overhear what's going on. And so then, yeah, so with this microchip, it's, and then the technical term is a tensiometer, which they're used in the soil often to measure water status in the soil, but we made a bunch of tweaks so they could actually be used in the tree itself. And so with that, you put it in the tree and it measures the water status in the xylem, which is the water carrying tissue of the tree. And so then, yeah, we measure the pulse. So generally, you have the tree that is wettest around 6 a.m. And then the sun comes out and then the water status drives down. And so you see this like drop towards more and more negative, lower values of water status, and until I guess the lowest point around what 2 to 4 p.m. And then it starts recovering once it's sun starts going down and whatever. And so the actual raw data looks like that. It looks like a little wave that goes up and down, just like you must have a pulse. Your pulse maybe it's like once a second. The trees have a pulse of once a day, so it's substantially slower. And with this, right, we have this information. We can compare it against guidelines that have been established using a manual instrument called the pressure chamber. And so the pressure chamber works great. But it's just very manual. You gotta like take a leaf, you cut it, you put it in this chamber, and then you squeeze it with high pressure gas. And the harder you have to squeeze to get water out, the thirstier the tree is. And so a lot of validation has been done with that instrument. But you basically get like 1 point a week, maybe, and you got to send somebody out there when it's really hot. So with our technology, we give people the same information, but just automatically
Yeah.
24/7. And so then I think the growers that are most poised to take advantage of FloraPulse are the ones that already use the pressure chamber, right? And then those are all at least the initial early adopters. And so, anyways, you get the data of the water status of the tree, and then you can compare that against the guidelines, right? So, for example, if we talk about some of our biggest crops, really is almonds. So almonds, during the beginning of the season, you want to keep it. Let's just say it's 8 to 12, and that's like pretty wet. So you keep it wet initially because you just want the tree to grow. But then when it gets a little bit down the season, you want to dry a little bit more. So you might go to like 12 to 16. And then when you're gonna shake the almonds, right, you want them to be really dry because that helps
Yeah.
the shaking come out better. And so then at that point, you might dry the tree even further. And so being able to really fine tune that because you're seeing that has a lot of advantages because you keep the trees happy, you have higher yields, more consistent results year over year. And then even the shaking, right? Like if your almonds are not dry enough, then your shaking would not go as well. So you might have like a bunch of almonds still stuck there, which just leads to a lot of problems because then you have almonds there, you might have to shake them again. And if you leave them, then you have more problems with what's called mummy nuts, which are nuts that stay over the winter, and then that leads to evil orange worm problems. So there's just all these things, and so with florables, you can like tweak that to get the right results. Um, and so yeah, that's kind of how everything works out a little bit.
Yeah, that makes sense, and that's interesting. So I know when I originally did the first story on Flora Pulse, I think one of the questions I asked was, about damage. You're obviously inserting something into a tree or a vine, so I was always worried about some kind of
Mhm.
damage or being, a vector for some kind of disease or something to get in. Obviously, that's not the case. But I think that was my immediate reaction was just, "Oh, you're adding something." I mean, obviously, it's not the only time something like that's done, but,
Yeah, no, so people have expressed there's a few concerns that come out. That's one of them. And the honest answer is that it's very so we're putting one sensor for like every 5 10 acres, so it's such a
yeah,
sparse amount. And the trees they get wounded all the time, and we make a wound, but everything is sterile, and we seal it. So we've have never had any problems with anything like that. And then yeah, but the point of like moving the seeds around is it's a real one, but it's mainly it's insects, right? You have an insect that goes and
yeah,
like pulls something from this tree and puts in the other one, and that becomes a huge problem. For example, in citrus, oranges that have the citrus greening disease.
yep,
There's issues with that, but with florals, it hasn't been a problem, and yeah, it's just not an issue. People always wonder about like how many do you need, right? And so that's an important question. We generally, right, when you set up a block and then you have a field, let's say you have 20 acres, you generally segregate that into blocks. Irrigation
yeah,
blocks are relatively similar. That way, when you turn on the tab, you irrigate all these trees that are, all about the same. And so with FloraPulse, you basically just need to put one sensor in a representative tree, and then you can use that to irrigate the whole block. So you're looking at pretty sparse because the technology, it is new technology. It's not exactly cheap, but we believe it pays for itself, and so it's important to kind of not be too wantonly and then put a whole bunch of things out there. Also, because like data by itself, and so this is one thing where we kind of just get into the weeds here, but data by itself is not useful. You really want actionable data.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the problems that people had initially with like aerial imaging. Right? It looks great. You have these like beautiful pictures, and you see like, oh, this tree is a little bit, greener or redder. But then, what do you do with it? Because sure, there's like this one tree, but can you really do anything with it? And so they've had to work over time to develop good guidelines of what the data means. So at least for us, we were lucky in that sense because the data, this kind of data, has been studied already. And people know that there are like huge benefits with using the solar instrument. And yeah, and I think eventually I should bring up a little case study. We had some work with a grower in Chile that they had some really good results. So we can talk about that as well.
Yeah, well, you read my mind. I was definitely going to ask about that. So, I was kind of curious about like locations and things like that. And then it sounds
Mhm.
like there's maybe some additional crops that are going to be utilized with the smaller version. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and then you can kind of reference into the
Sure.
case study, because I'm kind of curious too with the smaller ones. You need with the smaller florables, do you need more? Is it, is it just your smaller sample size, or like talk about crops, and then
Mhm.
we could go into case study.
Yeah. So if we just start, there's a few things that we can. If we talk about geography, right? FloraPulse is the only company in the world with this type of technology.
Yeah.
We're the only ones that can consistently measure water potential for months on end.
Yeah.
And so that means that we get interest worldwide, right? And so it's been super cool because we've sold to a lot of different countries, a lot of scientists and growers, and these people just kind of come to us, right? So we've sold, for example, just thinking about it, throughout the United States. We sold in Canada, we sold in Chile, Argentina has some, and then if we look to Europe, there's like in Switzerland, we have in Germany, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal. We have things in New Zealand, in Australia,
Yeah.
we have some in South Africa. So there's been kind of all over the place. And a lot of it just been driven by, scientists and growers that just kind of want to try this out. And so, yeah, so they kind of come to us there. It's also interesting, right? Because the growing season is, right now it's kind of coming to a close here, but then it starts in the southern
Yep.
hemisphere. And so this is part of why we're so excited about, doing business with like Chile, for example, and New Zealand, because now that we're kind of mostly done with the United States and North America, then we can start doing sales in these other countries. But it's funny, like a lot of the crops that I feel like California is great. It's been a blessing to be here because
Yeah.
a lot of the crops, if not all the crops, like the vast majority of the crops that we're interested in are grown here. Right? So it just allows us to do some testing and do some initial sales and everything. And then, we can go from there. We've also been very lucky we're right next to UC Davis. We have a really strong collaboration with Professor Ken Shackle and a few others as well there. So we've done like great. So the location is super important. When it comes to crops, yeah. So the story is basically we developed a sensor, right, and it was kind of it was a little bit bigger. Let's just say it's about the size of my thumb
Yeah.
initially, which is it's fine. But then that kind of limits the crops that we can go into. And so then well, what it meant is that we could only go into crops that were 2 inches in diameter. So,
Yeah.
maybe like this big, which, is pretty big, but then it eliminates a lot of the wine grapes.
Yes.
So we've been kind of working over the last couple of years with the funding of the USDA, and also the National Science Foundation, a few others, to yeah, kind of develop this a smaller version of the sensor, right? So the technology is kind of the same, but we just kind of shrunk everything down and made a lot of improvements to how things are installed to get more accurate data. And kind of just getting into the weeds here, you're trying to measure water potential in plants, and then so there's some things that we learned that you really, for example, you want to access the most active xylem,
Yeah.
and so that's the xylem that's on the outer part of the tree, and so we kind of tweaked the sensor to be installed more shallowly. That's one thing. We've also had to deal with like wounding responses. So when you wound a plant, many of them have like produced these gels that would normally just block measurement. And so we've come up with ways to like seal the sensor better, so that then we don't have these problems. We've worked with things like we've had a lot of interest in walnut, and walnut has been a challenging crop to work with because it has like a very strong wounding response. So then
Oh,
we came up with a way of installing the sensor into the pith of the plant, and this was actually one of an idea from Ken Shackle, one of our collaborators. And that seems to be working much better. So we might be kind of launching that next year. And so, in a nutshell, for these smaller crops, we've been able to get some good results now in hemp. It's just for fun, right? We've tried hemp, we've done corn, blueberries, and cotton. That's looking good. He did the smaller wine grapes as well. Let's see what else, and then you kind of just like the smaller trees. And so yeah, so we've been, and then another thing that we haven't really talked about, it's not really relevant to growers much, but we've had a lot of interest from forestry. So we developed some sensors specifically for these trees that are huge and have like bark that sometimes is like this thick,
oh wow.
which
Yeah.
makes it complicated to install it normally. I say, and then we have these like beautiful pictures of people installing them like 50, 50 meters up or whatever, like way up there. They like climb up these trees, right? Which,
That's
good luck
crazy.
to them. And then they're like installing on sensors out there. So that's super cool just to get this kind of like validation from
Yeah.
Germany or from like wherever.
That's really neat. So we teased like a case study. I think that's, you know, obviously if we're going to be talking about pricing and things like that, it's very much going to depend on what you need, the size, everything. I realize there are some variables that someone listening and watching might need to
Mhm.
tweak in order to get an answer, but I'd love to hear like case study in terms of water savings because I do think that's a really interesting thing is like how long either having the FloraPulse has paid for itself or type of water
Mhm.
savings that someone might experience using kind of this more tweaked irrigation process, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, and this is it's a good question, right? And the
Yeah.
answer is nuanced because
Yes.
it you gotta look at there's things that we care about society. That's a society. So water savings is one of them. And then, but a grower that's going to pay for things that
Yep.
it really matters their bottom line. And so water, so we help save water. So I will talk about that. I think a lot of the growers are they're most excited about just kind of just having like, hey, I just know my field is being taken care of, and then if I can increase yields, better, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of what drives that equation is really the yields and the yield increases. But so how much water you save really depends on the crop and how well you're irrigating currently. But we have seen, up to 50% or even higher.
Wow.
For example, if I talk about this specific grower in Chile that did a lot of work. So the thing is, in Chile, the labor is way cheaper, so they were able to do a lot of water potential measurements with the other instrument. And so we provide the same information for just were accessible. So using this type of data, these guys in Chile, this was in Prune, they decreased irrigation by 40%. And this was
Oh
over the
wow.
course of many years, right? So
Yeah.
that was an average. So it wasn't like a fluke. They decreased irrigation by 40%. They let's see, then they increased their yields by 15%. So this overall increased their revenue per acre by $700 or so. Right. So it's a big number, right? So if you look at if you're installing one sensor for every 10, 20 acres, then you might be looking at $7,000 return on investment there, or like $14,000 for praying specifically. They also had other improvements. So that's by irrigating according to the needs of the tree, they completely eliminated fruit drop. They were getting like 30% fruit drop. That decreased basically zero.
Oh wow.
And then they also decreased the need for propane drying, right? So praise you want to dry them, right? And so, but since the tree was kind of not as wet because they didn't need to irrigate it as much, then they spend less money on that.
That's
But
just it
we have
makes
seen, mhm.
no, go
And
ahead.
just to finish that thought, yeah. So Professor Ken Shackle here did a study presented at the Almond Conference last year, and yeah, he found that by irrigating according to this thing, he was finding like 40% decrease in water. So
Wow.
it's possible, right? It's not we can't promise that, but it definitely happens.
No, but I think the other thing, at least with the case study that you kind of illustrated, is there's some other benefits, not just within the water. We're talking about fruit drop. If that's a stress result, you're able to monitor what type of stress the tree is under. Right. So that's a important thing there, which I think is interesting. And then talking about kind of the other effects too. um, which I think is really great. So, we're at the end of my question. So this was kind of broad, and I don't really know where you're going to go with it. So let's talk about the future. So, what's the future for irrigation tech? As you kind of said, there's in the beginning your pitch that there's there might be wars fought over water in the
Hopefully
future.
not.
Yeah, I hope me too. I hope not, but
Yeah,
I do. It is. I obviously I don't live in California. I live in a state that right now has good water access. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case forever, right? I think water use is going to become more scrutinized and more in focus. And so, what where is the future of water and ag and FloraPulse going? If you could take your crystal ball and kind
sure.
of see where things are going, it could be 5 years. I know like 10, 20 is pretty lofty and kind of out there. So like where do you see things going?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, who knows? But I there's a
Yeah.
few trends that are pretty clear. I think one of them is just that we are noticing problems that we didn't notice before, and so you know, for example, the problems that have been cropping up have been like the overuse of groundwater research, right? So especially in California, right? So and this is when they see like the ground kind of dropping, and so this is not sustainable. I've also seen problems with where the water is not managed properly, and so then it ends up being very salty. So
Yeah.
if you kind of if you pull too
Polluted.
much water and you don't do it right, then you end up with like too much boron or too much salt, and so then the water becomes unusable. There's things like that. There's things where like the reservoirs they might be full, but then you might have a five-year drought, and then by the
Yeah.
end of that, you're kind of done. You might be growing trees in areas that really shouldn't be growing trees because the water there is really scarce and it's just not sustainable. So I think that a lot of the political politics is very important for agriculture to the chagrin of growers because they get more
Yeah.
regulations, which is no fun. But yeah, so we're kind of discovering all these problems, and I think a lot of it is just the government and society is just kind of putting more pressure and just kind of finding the right ways to deal with things so that is sustainable, right? Because we have more,
Yeah.
more people, um, and so I think these rules now they're kind of they're tracking how much water you're using, and then it all needs to be sustainable. There's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So I think all of these pressures are making agriculture more efficient, in the long run, right? And right now
Yeah.
it is painful for growers. And so I think a lot of that is just kind of there might be movement of where the fields are located, and this is already happening, right? People are following
Yeah.
their fields because they're like, they won't be able to get the water they need there. So I think we're heading in the right direction, and these problems, yeah, we're aware, and they're putting these solutions, and
Good.
they're doing it in a really smart way, right? They're like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It's like a 30-year law, right? Where like it phases in over 30 years, and so it gives people time to figure things out. But then, tools like FloraPulse help with just kind of fine tuning because I think what growers will need eventually is to be able to say, yeah, like I am using water very effectively. Here's the proof, right? And so
Yeah.
I think government will want to see that. And tools like FloraPulse will be critical on that. To just make sure that you have like the highest yields possible for your crop. Um, but and countries they figure it out, right? Like if California has their droughts and things, but like if you have countries that have like much worse droughts, and they still figure it out, right? So we're in a good spot. If you look at Australia, they have I would think
True.
harder problems with water. Clearly, Israel, they have to desalinate water, which is extremely expensive, but they still do it. So there are ways. It's just and I am very glad that all these problems are coming to the fore because we have created very very smart people. So then things can be figured out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good point. That obviously water use is going to be scrutinized, but you're right. I think we're going to hear more and more about proof. Like if you're sustain, I do a lot of stories on sustainability, and a lot of that is now the focus of proving that you're doing X, Y, and Z that you're claiming that you are. So having kind of that data to back up your sustainability claims, I think is going to be the future. So that was a really good point.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah,
Well, that's all the questions I had. So, I just want to thank you, Michael, for joining me. I know we've just scratched the surface of irrigation. So yeah, I think the point of the podcast too is that you're getting just the the scratch the surface of topics. So,
Yes. Yeah.
um, yeah, thank you for joining me. This has been a great conversation. I'd love to have you on, maybe talk in a little while when you've kind of deployed some of those other new technologies and just kind of see what you're learning as you're bringing more crops online. Um, and I'd love to thank the listeners too. Thank you for tuning in. And don't forget, if you like what you hear, you can catch new episodes of Tip of the Iceberg on your favorite podcast platform like Google, Spotify, Apple, and more. And that's a wrap for this edition of Tip of the Iceberg, brought to you by the Packer Produce Market Guide and Farm Journal. Join us again soon for more industry insights. Thanks.